Hey, women of welcome. It's Bree Stensrud here, and I want to talk about probably a lot of the headlines and images that you are seeing on news right now with Title 42 ending and a lot of people showing up at the southern border. So, we're going to talk with our supporting partner, World Relief, and we're going to just talk about why people are coming, what is happening at the border right now, and I'm going to let Matt Soerens in. Headlines that we see and how to interpret them and what they mean and what's really going on. I think one of the biggest questions that people have as we wait for Matt to join on here is the border open? Hey, Matt. And that's one of the questions we're going to talk about today because for some, it kind of feels like it is. So we're going to talk about that in the next, 15, 20 minutes or so. So hang with us as we just talk about what's going on at the southern border right now. So today is the last day that Title 42, and we'll talk about what Title 42 is, will be in place. Title 42 is kind of an old era health code policy that the Trump administration had put in place during the COVID years. Today, nationally, the government is saying that the COVID pandemic is officially ending. And so Title 42, the justification for that was that we didn't want to expose more Americans to COVID. And so they were using the Title 42 policy as a way and a means of protecting Americans from the spread of COVID. And yet, I think we all know that COVID restrictions have long lifted in this country. And so Title 42 has actually been being used as a stopgap for the flood of people that are looking for hope in America. And so Matt and I are going to just talk about that today because tonight at midnight, Title 42 ends. And I think a lot of the images that we're seeing, a lot of the video, the news that we're seeing is we're seeing long lines of people at the border waiting for their opportunity to come into the U.S. So with Title 42 ending, there's some questions that we have. So Matt Soerens, he is VP over at World Relief over church engagement and advocacy. And he is, again, one of the only men we allow in the Women of Welcome community. So hi, Matt. Good to see you. Okay, so let's talk about this. What is happening at the border? Because the imagery that we see in the videos and news that we see, it feels like a very chaotic.
Yeah, I mean, you and I were together at one part of the border in Tijuana and San Diego just a couple weeks ago, Bree, with some of the World Relief SoCal team, and it has gotten even more chaotic since then. There's a very large number of people approaching the U.S. border from the Mexican side of the border, and as you said, that's at least related to the end of Title 42. Now, it's worth noting, this is all happening with Title 42 still in effect. And we have seen very large numbers of people coming to the U.S.-Mexico border in the last 2 years with Title 42 in effect. So this idea that somehow Title 42 causes people to come to the border doesn't make a lot of sense. But there are a lot of rumors, some based on partial truths, some based on misinformation or even disinformation. Some of that is fueled by smugglers who have a profit incentive to try to get people to come to the border. And we have, just yesterday, very large numbers of people were apprehended at the U.S.-Mexico border, beyond what our government really has the capacity to process in the ways that it's supposed to under U.S. law. And frankly, beyond the capacity of churches and nonprofit organizations that are really valiantly caring for people on both sides of the border. And right now, there's a lot of people sort of built up on the Mexican side of the border who have been waiting, because as you said, Title 42, it's a public health law. It's really hard to justify it on public health grounds at this point. But what it has done is it basically said the U.S. government is not going to follow our asylum laws because of public health reasons. Now, there's been various exceptions made for people of different nationalities, frankly, especially nationalities that Mexico refused to take back. So that's where we've seen a large number of Venezuelans coming and being allowed in at a certain point a few months back. And then somehow the U.S. persuaded Mexico to take Venezuelans back. But different nationalities have been coming. But there are certain nationalities that have been mostly barred from seeking asylum for 3+ years now, including some of the Northern Triangle countries of Central America. So a lot of them have been under the impression that this actually is their opportunity. The irony in that, and I think tragically from my perspective, is the Biden administration has been clear that they are not just going to relax Title 42 and go back to Title 8, which is our immigration laws. It's the asylum laws that Congress passed decades ago. And what were in effect during the Trump administration prior to COVID-19 and during the Obama administration. Instead, the Biden administration has proposed a bunch of new regulations that will really dramatically restrict who is eligible for asylum and who can seek asylum at the border and the process for doing so. So the reality is, even once this goes into effect, we actually probably will see more people being turned away, but that's not stopping more people from coming. And it is true that some people will either come in surreptitiously and there's just not the capacity to process them, or the U.S. government is so overwhelmed that they don't have the capacity, from what we understand, to really follow the process that would usually be in effect for those who are professing to have a credible fear of persecution. And that's a frustrating challenge that we've been urging the Biden administration to prepare for. They would say, well, the Congress hasn't appropriated the resources to us to prepare for that adequately. And we've said to Congress as well, on a bipartisan basis, we should have a secure border. Nobody benefits when people are coming in across the border and the U.S. government doesn't know who they are. There ought to be processes in place there. And yet our laws also very rightly offer protection to those who have a credible fear of persecution for particular reasons under the law. And we shouldn't sacrifice that latter legal commitment, and I would argue a moral commitment, rooted in the idea that human beings are made in the image of God and their lives have value, out of concerns for the former. And so that's kind of what's happening now. It's chaotic, large numbers of people coming. It'll probably be chaotic for a little while, although I actually think in the medium term, because one of the things Title 42 does, it doesn't let people who are ineligible for asylum, it doesn't usually have them deported back to their countries of origin. So for non-Mexicans, which is the majority of people showing up, they've just been being turned over to Mexico as opposed to being flown back to their country of origin. Well, if you walked from Venezuela to the US border and you were turned back right over the border, would you walk back to Venezuela? Most people, no, they would try again the next day and the next day. Understandably, they fled often really horrific situations. But I think that we will see, with some elements of our normal immigration laws going back into effect, there will be less recidivism, so less people crossing multiple times because there will be more formal deportations happening. All of this plays into the reality that we have a large number of people who are very vulnerable, many of whom I think have very strong claims for asylum under U.S. law, some of whom don't, some of whom are really fleeing poverty or other hardship, but each of whom is still made in the image of God, each of whom is still a neighbor whom Christians are called to love as ourselves. And it is just a really difficult situation for the Border Patrol, for other parts of the U.S. government, for the churches on the ground who are working without sleep, trying to care for people. And that's on the ground in the U.S. side, but also on the Mexican side, who've been dealing with this for years. And it's an important time for people who follow Jesus to step up, to respond.
Yeah, and I mean, just if you're just now joining us, I just saw a flood of people just joining us, we're talking about what's currently happening at the southern border and, kind of the historic numbers that are happening at the border with people showing up, some with valid claims, some without, some, not knowing what a valid claim is, but needing the opportunity to have process as far as being able to determine whether they have a credible fear or not, or if they meet asylum qualifications. But what's currently happening at the border is you have the president sending over 1,500 troops to kind of reinforce and rebarricade and beef up kind of the deterrence measures that they currently have at the border. It's kind of an all hands on deck approach as they anticipate with the end of Title 42 tonight, that there could be even more, an increased number of people thinking this might be their only hope to get into the U.S. Let's just address this right off the bat. The Biden administration has said that the border is not open. And yet, when we look at all of the people that seem to be coming and seem to be being processed and whatnot, it feels like the narrative that we're getting and that we're seeing, at least in images and throughout the news, is that that because of the policies that are inactive or that are active right now, that the border is kind of effectively open, because it seems like thousands and thousands of people are allowed into the U.S. What is actually the reality of that? Because I do think that's a very important thing for us to acknowledge, that it does sometimes feel like the border actually is open because of the amount of people that are being processed. Help us understand a little bit how to think through
the U.S.-Mexico border is never fully open, and it's never fully closed. There are lots of people coming, and they're not all treated exactly the same way under the terms of U.S. law. So every single day, tons of people lawfully enter the United States through a port of entry. So clearly the border's not closed. Every single day, lots of other people are apprehended and turned back. or apprehended and formally detained and then formally deported. So like that's on their legal record. Sometimes that, that involves an airplane ride to a different part of the world. That's all happening now. In fact, what the Biden administration has announced will actually increase the number of people who will be deported among those who are coming to the U.S.-Mexico border, pretty dramatically so, starting tomorrow, including some people who, in my view of the law and from a Christian perspective, are going to basically, face the risk of deportation without really due process to seek asylum under the terms of U.S. law. Now, so it's open to some people, it's closed to some people. The real challenge is for those who are allowed into the United States. Usually they're given a court date. Right now, we understand some people are being given a notice to appear with ICE, with Immigration Customs Enforcement, without even being given a court date because they don't have the staff to even process. Though that still happens after people are vetted and verified that they're not a public safety threat. That's, the Department of Homeland Security is trying to do. But most of those people they're using alternatives to detention wherever they have the capacity to do that. So that's a GPS ankle bracelet or this thing that looks like a phone where you can kind of check in and you're required to check in with ICE. It's obviously GPS tracked. The goal there is to make sure that people show up for their immigration court hearings when they're supposed to. And this is not a new challenge. This is going on for years. It's gotten worse and worse. That's a challenge because their court dates will be well out into the future in many cases. And if they do have an asylum claim, first of all, they've got to find an immigration attorney or a legal services representative, which can be really difficult. Like we're maxed out in a lot of our legal services offices around the country at World Relief. We're doing the best we can, but it's just challenging right now with large numbers of asylum seekers. And at the same time, those individuals do not qualify in most cases to work lawfully till 5 months after they file their asylum application. So this is actually...
Let me ask you this, Matt, because this is a good question that people have asked us. Just to reiterate for those who are joining, is that the border is not open, even though sometimes it may feel like it is because of the number of people we're processing. But we have never had, really since
roughly a century,
for several decades now, unregulated and unmitigated immigration into the US. Yeah, roughly a century. So so essentially, it's closed to some people, it's open to others, but it right now is open and should be open for processing people who are vulnerable. And then we should be able to vet them and have due process to determine whether or not they should be here, because we do have a responsibility to U.S. citizens to know who and what is coming across the border. And we'll get to that also in a second, because we know that there are concerns about trafficking and drugs and all of that kind of stuff. I think what Matt is trying to communicate is the people that are working on the ground. Yes, deportations are happening. No, not everyone that's coming qualifies. We certainly do not have enough people, and the current administration is not appropriating enough resources and personnel to actually process the amount of people that are continuing to come, which is why we at Women of Welcome and at World Relief are constantly asking people to call and talk to your elected official about the public's will that we actually appropriate the right amount of resources so that we can actually process people quickly. Otherwise, they come in for processing. They're given a court date that could be several years out. And then they are doing life in our midst, but then they're in a mixed limbo status, and then they can be deported, but then maybe they've had children when they've been here. It's a really, really, it's messier than we all think that it is, but we don't have open borders right now is the answer really to that question, because we know that there are thousands. We had 10,000 people deported
yesterday. To Mexico,
so we know that it's not open to anybody and everybody. We know that. Yes, turn back into Mexico. So that's kind of the reality on the open border situation. I think there are some major concerns, obviously, that people have, and some of them have to do, obviously, with open border kind of conversations, but also human trafficking and drugs, particularly fentanyl. And I think we've constantly tried to continue to tell the real narrative that comes from CBP and that comes from Border Patrol, and that is that most of that drug and fentanyl trafficking comes through legal ports of entry and not in the middle in between along the fence line. But can you talk a little bit about some of these major concerns? What is the reality when it comes to human trafficking, when it comes to drug smuggling? Tell us a little bit about what you know statistically.
Well, first, in terms of drugs, I mean, there is a huge problem with drugs coming into the United States. And one of the primary places they come from or through is Mexico. And yet it is not true that they're coming with the people we're seeing on television screens right now. I've talked to Border Patrol agents, I think you've heard this as well, Bree, who have said that they've actually never encountered drugs on an asylum seeker, or it's incredibly rare. Occasionally, drug smugglers might use the asylum seekers as a distraction to try to, go down the border ways and bring drugs in between ports of entry. But even that is quite rare. It's 10% or so of the hard drugs that are coming into the United States. 90% roughly comes through ports of entry, and with most of the time with U.S. citizens.
And just think about that. And I just want to point out to that, because you just said, and we heard this a couple of weeks ago when we were in Tijuana and we were talking with Border Patrol, they're like, it does not make sense to put highly valuable drugs, illegal drugs, on vulnerable people that are presenting to Border Patrol, because they're going to be searched, so that those are drugs lost. So we just kind of have to think at least one layer deeper when we're hearing some of these narratives of like, all these people are bringing X. Well, all of these people who are presenting at the border are being searched and vetted by Border Patrol. And so we just have to think sometimes a little bit of like one layer deep. And like you were saying, that's not that activity isn't happening. It's just the likelihood is so low statistically.
Again, huge issues,
so
and
keep
we
going.
need a lot more resources
make sure we have that in
mind to catch more of it. But it doesn't do much to stop asylum seekers, if anything at all. The other question is human trafficking. So the one thing that's confusing about terminology is human trafficking sounds like illegally moving human beings. That's not actually what human trafficking means from a legal perspective. An illegal perspective in the United States, human trafficking is when someone is made to work or in either commercial work or sex work under force, fraud, or coercion. And that's a huge problem that affects immigrants often, but also affects native-born U.S. citizens who never cross the border. There's actually no part of that legal requirement that requires transportation. Now, what is also a crime is smuggling. Smuggling is when someone illegally brings someone into the United States without appropriate permission. Many of the people coming in right now are being smuggled. They have paid someone to help them come in. It's sometimes those smugglers are also traffickers. They will hold the fact that you owe them X, $5,000, $10,000 and say you're going to work in this situation until you pay us back. But often that's not the case. Often it's, they're paying for a service, an illegal service. I'm not condoning that. And those smuggling operations are often connected to Mexican drug cartels. So again, not bringing drugs on the same people, but they're two businesses that some of the same cartels are operating. But the human trafficking concern is also a concern on the Mexican side of the border, because when we send vulnerable people not from Mexico, but from some other country, often very far away, who made a very vulnerable trip, and we can send them back to the border, they're very much at risk of trafficking and of other violence or harm. And this is particularly true for children, which is why we have at World Relief for a long time said that we need to take particular special concern for kids, and especially an unaccompanied child who's not with their mother or father or legal guardian. We have laws within our anti-trafficking laws that actually are designed to protect those children, make sure that they are protected until it's determined in an immigration court whether they can safely be sent back to their country of origin or they should be allowed to stay lawfully and permanently in the United States. But one of the concerns that we have in response to the chaos at the border is we have politicians on both sides of the aisle at this point saying, well, let's just send everyone back to Mexico, kind of an extension of Title 42 without the public health rules. That would include unaccompanied children. And our government did that for a few years. It was one of the first exceptions the Biden administration made, and we were glad for that exception. But when Title 42 started, kids were just being shoved back over to Mexico with very limited effort to ensure their safety. And unfortunately, we know that some terrible things happen to some of those children. Again, these are, we just shouldn't go back to that. That doesn't mean the current situation is successful or adequate, but the response could actually make things even worse. And I would say we're seeing that. That's one proposal, is let's just extend some version of Title 42. I've already said at World Relief, we think the Biden administration's proposal, which would really dramatically restrict who's eligible for asylum, following some very similar policies to what the Trump administration proposed a few years ago. We don't think that's the answer either. We have voiced that to the Biden administration and publicly. And at the same time, we have legislation being considered even today in the House of Representatives. I think it's likely to get a vote today, that would even more dramatically restrict asylum and have effects on unaccompanied children, and actually limit the use of parole programs, which are a way that the U.S. government lets people in lawfully. And there's challenges with parole in terms of like long-term access to, renewing that. We've seen that with Afghans, Ukrainians, and others. But in the short term, at least, it's a much better solution to have people come, be verified their identity, and that they're in no way a public safety or public health threat, and let them come in lawfully. And then those people join the labor market 2 weeks after they arrive, or sometimes faster, Because the irony in all this, large numbers of people would actually not be a problem for the United States right now. We have a labor shortage, an incredible labor shortage, actually. Millions of more jobs than we have people looking for work, often in sectors of the economy like agriculture or construction, that immigrants tend to be very eager to join. The problem is when they're in an asylum process, they're usually ineligible to work lawfully. But if we had legal processes that avoided cartels, that avoided smugglers, where you presented yourself and entered lawfully, those people can integrate into the U.S. economy very quickly and often have family members who can help them integrate, have churches in partnership with organizations like World Relief that could very quickly help people integrate. This House bill would actually take back one of the tools that any presidential administration has to let people in lawfully in this sort of circumstance. So we have a lot of concerns there as well. And it would actually not allow the Department of Homeland Security to provide funds to faith-based organizations like Catholic Charities or others who are helping along the border in coordination with the federal government in certain cases. So there's a huge challenge, and my fear is that some of the proposals to address it, both from the Biden administration and from different parts of Congress, could actually make things even worse, especially in the long term, and really turn back our national back on some of our both legal but also, I think, moral commitments to stand with those who are persecuted.
So I think one of the questions that people have when there are open avenues for people to come, or when people do get processed, is where do they actually go? What are they allowed to do? And there's concerns of being a burden on taxpayer dollars, and being a burden on local communities that don't have a lot of resources or services for those who are coming. So can you address a little bit about those concerns too? Where do people go, and how does this all work once they are vetted and then released into the community on alternatives to detention?
Yeah, so most of
with
the time,
sponsor
not
families,
100%
where
of the cases,
are people
most of the
going,
time,
and what do
people
they
who
do?
show up know where they want to go because their cousin lives in Chicago, or their sister-in-law lives in Colorado Springs, or somewhere around the United States. And faith-based organizations partner with they basically help identify those family members or friends somewhere else in the country and book them bus tickets. And you and I have both been in the church basements in other parts in El Paso or Tijuana or San Diego or elsewhere that's happening. Then I think the other challenge, sorry, I lost my light here. What happens then, it depends on someone's on their status. If they're authorized to work, which some of the parolees can apply for work authorization, that's a huge benefit. They can become economically self-sufficient fairly quickly. I mean, it's a struggle, but that's a struggle that's, sort of the American story. When they're not authorized to work, it's harder. Some of them will end up working without authorization. Many of them will, because usually you're not getting your rent paid. I mean, certainly not by the federal government. There's a few cities, like the city of Chicago, near where I live, is doing some of that on a limited basis for a short time. But we've also, at World Relief, we've worked with host homes in San Diego to find people willing to host families who've come through and need a place to stay, even just for a few nights sometimes. We have a program here in the Chicagoland area where I'm at, which is very similar to our Good Neighbor team model that we've used for decades with refugees, but we call it the home program. It's the same thing, except for with the kind of caveat that because this is an asylum seeker without work authorization, we need to figure out how to cover rent for a little bit longer. So churches are helping to cover rent, sometimes by paying for rent, sometimes by offering like a parsonage or some other church space that the church owns. We want to do that wherever we can in whatever ways that we can, and then also connect people to legal services because they have a court date that they need to report for court. The need is definitely greater than what's available, and that's true pretty much everywhere in the country. We're seeing that very acutely in some major cities where people are showing up, and sometimes these are the kind of the exception who don't know where they want to go. They don't have a cousin in Aurora, Illinois, so they've heard of New York City on television or some other major cities, and that tends to be where they end up. So it's it's a challenge for those cities where there's large number of people arriving on a regular basis. And again, the biggest part of the challenge is that they're not authorized to work. If they were, there are jobs in all those cities. In fact, there are labor shortages in all those cities. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a political will to change that in the current moment, but I think that's an obvious part of the solution would be having more people who've been vetted and verified who could lawfully work and provide for themselves, rather than having to just pool resources to help churches or nonprofits or local governments provide for them.
Right. Yeah. So the need is great, and people are going to continue to come. I think one of the things we have to revisit is, why are so many people coming? Why are so many people coming? And I would also just want to remind us and just let us know that, like, from what we're hearing, what we're seeing statistically, there are so many non-Spanish speaking people coming from Central and South America, but also the Caribbean islands that are coming. They're coming from Africa, and they're showing up at these shelters. And when I hear that, I think, wow, in this country, we keep praying for revival. We keep praying for the Lord to reach the nations, and we keep sending money and people and personnel to other nations to tell them about Jesus. And yet, what we see all the time when we go and visit shelters, when we see people crossing, when we see the statistics of people who are coming, the nations are actually here on our doorstep. And, you know, Matt, I'd love for you to just maybe help us understand why
to your
are
last
so
point
many
there, I think
people
part of the
coming.
reason they're coming,
Help us
if you read
understand
Acts
that.
chapter 17, is that from one man, God made every nation of men and establishes the times and places where they should live for a purpose, that men would seek him. So there's like a providential role of God in that. And it's worth noting that's not just people who don't know Jesus who come to the United States and encounter the gospel in the United States. It's also people who bring a very vibrant Christian faith with them. I mean, you and I have both experienced that among migrants and asylum seekers on the Mexican side of the border, stuck in church shelters, who are prayer warriors, who have relied on God to sustain them through really difficult journeys. And again, often from Latin America, but also from beyond in some cases. But the more practical, like sociological reasons and economic reasons why people are coming, I'd say it's a mix of legal avenues to migration in the United States being dramatically restricted during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we all but shut down refugee resettlement, not even just during COVID-19, but even before that as a matter of policy. And one of the effects of that is if you were hoping to be resettled in the United States, your odds became, they've always been slim, frankly, but they became next to zero. And people who were desperate enough who could get to the Western Hemisphere came in large numbers. And we've seen that especially with Venezuela. In my mind, if any normal time, the U.S. would have had a robust resettlement programs for Venezuelans. And the refugee resettlement program really hasn't. It's been very, very small numbers. And it's far, but it is, you know, you can theoretically come on land from Venezuela. It's in the Western Hemisphere. The other dynamic is just we've seen global poverty. I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic, beyond the public health effects, had a horrific effect. And we've done reporting on this at World Relief. We've seen this in our programs in Africa and elsewhere in Haiti. Has had just a horrifying effect of setting back a lot of progress in fighting global poverty. So beyond conflict, which is also real, and persecution, which is acute in certain parts of the world, more people are living in poverty, struggling to feed their families, struggling to make ends meet. And that's true even in Mexico, you know, just to the south. And so we've seen, after years of declining numbers of Mexicans coming to the U.S.-Mexico border, many, many years of declines there, that started to increase again, as well as the COVID had a huge economic impact on Mexico. And people are hungry, and they're struggling, and they've heard that there's work opportunities in the United States. And again, they weren't wrong when they heard that. There are work opportunities in the United States. The problem is our legal system, which we've been advocating for changes in for years and decades, nearly at World Relief, doesn't have the legal avenues for people to go to their consulate, file for either a temporary or even a permanent work-based visa, and come on, you know, a reasonable time frame after going through some reasonable vetting and processing. If we had more of those visas, my view is we'd see far, far, far fewer people coming and making an incredibly dangerous trip, subjecting themselves to just really awful circumstances on the journey and even once they arrive in the United States. And it's worth mentioning too, even those who are allowed to come in and pursue their asylum claim, tens of thousands of them are detained for long periods of time. I mean, they're held in jail-like facilities waiting for their asylum. So that's another option besides being turned away or being led into the United States to seek asylum. Our detention facilities governmentally are pretty packed out, and World Relief serves in some of those as well, at least one of them outside of Seattle, where we're doing ministry in one of these detention facilities, ministering to people who are in a very vulnerable situation. But that's where I feel like the response needs to be all of the above, right? We need to address the situations that people are feeling that they have no choice to leave from: the economic desperation, the poverty, the conflict and persecution, environmental degradation. And that's some of the work that we do at World Relief in some of the countries that people are fleeing from. We also need to have a humanitarian response at the border, on the Mexican side of the border, for those who are in transit, and also for those who frankly are going to be turned back to Mexico under Title 42 and under the new rules that go into place starting to, you know, in a few hours. And then we also need a response for those right at the border on the U.S. side. Sometimes there's just a short-term processing. We do some of that at World Relief in San Diego and helping, you know, provide host families in some cases for people who need a short-term place to stay. collaborating with local churches. And then that distributes all across the United States, where some of those people are going to be able to stay and rebuild their lives seeking asylum in the United States. That's not all of them. They're not all going to qualify. But at every point in that journey, there are opportunities for the church to step up. And that's we can talk about governmental policy, and I think that's important. And, I'm the advocacy guy at World Relief. I care about that. What is even more important to me is that the church does its job. And if we want to know what the church's job is, we have this beautiful story in the Gospels. And I remember citing the same story when we saw large numbers of Afghans trying to get out of Afghanistan, where Jesus is with a huge thousands and thousands of people, and his disciples, who are very apparently kind of logistically oriented, said, Lord, this is like too. He does so. Obviously, you have the little boy with his loaves and fishes, and that's not enough to give them to eat, but Jesus comes into the equation and makes it enough. When people come forward with what they have, what God has entrusted to them, it can be enough. And I think that story, it inspires me because I see little churches in Mexico who partner with us. Evie and I both visited some of those churches who have very little, but they're offering the little bit they have, and God's using it. We're seeing churches on the U.S. side. We're seeing churches in countries like Haiti who are saying, we're going to make our country livable. We're going to fight for our country so people don't feel that they have no choice but to leave. And, I think that's the lesson. If we want to follow Jesus' example, it's to not say, the government has its job. We're not saying the government has to take everybody in. They have a responsibility. But our role is for those whom we encounter to say, can we give them something to eat? Can we meet human needs as an expression of the love of Jesus?
Yeah, and I think you might have cut out a little bit in there, Matt, because I think the connection got a little haywire or whatnot. But one of my favorite stories that Matt was just explaining is, in the Gospels, when you have thousands of people coming to see Jesus on the Mount, and they're coming for hope and they're coming to see Jesus, but you have thousands and thousands of people coming to the U.S. And Jesus' first response to this massive crowd of people, the scriptures say it was compassion. And his disciples worried about it. They were like, we don't have anything to feed these people. We're tired ourselves. We have our own things. We'd like some time with you. We're tired and we're hungry. We should just send them away so that they can fend for themselves and find out and work this out for themselves. And Jesus immediately says to them, you feed them. You feed them. And I think it's just a lesson for us to think about, what is our posture when we see this many people at the border? No, not everybody can come in. No, we are not advocating for open borders. We don't actually have open borders because we know there are thousands of people being deported and expelled and turned away every single day. So we know that. We know that we can't handle anyone and everyone. We know that we should be caring about who comes in and what comes in across the border. That's an obligation and a responsibility to our citizens. But as Christians, it's like a heart check. When we see this many people at the border, is our first response to turn them away because fill in the blank? Or is it compassion? And that compassion should motivate us in very specific ways, one of which we know is also in the Bible, and that is that to use our voice for those who don't have a voice. And so for these people who are hanging on to every bit of hope that coming to the U.S. would provide an ethical job for them, something that they could be a part of, that would feed their family, that would love on their family, that would give them hope. That is something that we should take very seriously and think, okay, we are meeting this humanitarian crisis with a military response. And some of that probably is appropriate in order to secure safety for this country. But the lion's share of it is not meeting the humanitarian crisis that is happening. I just was watching on AP News last night and this morning, just some of the imagery about what's going on the border and people crossing over the Rio Grande and whatnot. And I saw a father, and it startled me. I saw a father wading through these reeds along the Rio Grande, and he had a baby wrapped in a pink blanket in a suitcase. And he was using the suitcase as a boat to float his daughter across to the other side. And I immediately thought of Exodus 1 and 2. And I thought about putting Moses in a basket among the reeds and just praying to God for protection and praying to God that you could get somewhere where you could find safety. And I think we have to think about this biblically. We know that there are only 36% of evangelicals that think about immigration through the lens of their Bible, that are influenced by what the Bible says first and foremost about immigration. And I think that calls us to a revisiting of what does the Bible say my heart posture should be. And then our heart posture should lead us to be using our voice. And what does using our voice look like? It looks like calling your elected official and saying, we're not doing enough. I don't know exactly what we're doing. I don't know exactly all the ins and outs, but we've got to do better. And these are people who are deserving of dignity and respect and our care and our concern. And so we've got to do better. Please work harder across the aisle to do better. And in the meantime, there are lots of entities that you can support that are doing work on the ground. World Relief is one of those, from legal services to preventative programs and measures in other countries where people are fleeing from and coming from. It's a great opportunity to get involved with supplying more loaves and fish for all of the work that's needed.
I would
so
just
Matt,
say,
is there anything else that you think we should address or talk about? I mean, we've talked about some of the hot stuff, drugs, open borders. I mean, if you haven't heard all that, skip back to the front. We talked about some of that
I would
stuff.
just encourage people, two things. One, if people want to help now, if they go to worldrelief.org/border-response, there's, we can definitely use help right now. And there's also opportunities to volunteer in communities around the United States. This isn't just an issue at the border, as people are in some cases allowed through. And the other thing I would say, advocacy, as you mentioned, Bree, 100% is important. I would also say prayer is really important. I mean, it's hard to work for the Border Patrol right now. There are not enough of those people to do the job that they've been given. It's hard to be on the other side of the border, and there's Mexican governmental officials who are strained. Church leaders on both sides of the border who are really heroically caring for people. Government officials in DC who have policy decisions that they need to make, and I think unfortunately are sometimes failing to make the decisions and the compromises to actually pass legislation. And then most importantly for the migrants and immigrants, asylum seekers themselves, who are incredibly vulnerable, that God would protect them, that God would provide for them, that may or may not be in the United States, but wherever, that they would be safe, and that they would encounter people who would be that good Samaritan to them and show them love when they're a vulnerable traveler in need.
And I think that's a good point to make, because sometimes this feels very, very far away from us. And I live in Colorado, so I don't live near the border at all, and you might not either. What that means is a lot of these people, not all of them that are presenting at the border, but a lot of these people will be in your community as they await their asylum hearings. And what that means is they are going to get close. They are going to be near you. And what that means is reaching out to your local World Relief, Catholic Charities, or Lutheran Family Services offices to say, how can I help support families who are here seeking asylum? I went by and did a grocery run for an Afghan family that was here the other week. And while I was there, a father and his daughter walked up the stairs, and they had just made it through the process, and they had walked through the Darien Gap from Venezuela. And I could have nearly cried because there was a father and a daughter who had been through so much, seen probably so much, and there they were standing in front of me in the center of Colorado Springs. And I just thought, it's closer than we think. It's closer than we think. So for those of you who have been tuning in, we're so glad you're here. We're so glad you care. Matt and I have been talking about, what does the ending of Title 42 mean? What exactly is it? Do we have open borders right now? What are the policies that are going into effect? What about drugs? What about human smuggling and trafficking? So if you haven't seen that, rewind to the beginning and you'll catch all of that. So we'll put the link in the bio about where Matt was saying we could use some help. And we'll put that link in the comments section here once we get done, so that you can link on that and see where you can help in your area. So thanks so much, Matt. We love partnering with you guys, and thanks for staying in